The day Walter Sheffield died was unseasonably warm for October. I remember because the hospice room window was cracked open, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of late-blooming roses from the garden I'd planted for him 3 summers ago. His breaths had grown shallow over the past 48 hours, each one spaced further apart than the last, like he was practicing for the final exhale. "It's okay, Walter," I whispered, squeezing his papery hand between mine. "You can let go. Now, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The hospice nurse had told me this morning it would be today. After 4 years of caring for my father-in-law through his battle with Parkinson's, I'd learned to read the subtle shifts in his condition, the bluish tint around his lips, the mottling on his skin, the way his eyes would fix on something in the corner of the room that no one else could see. I dabbed a moistened sponge against his cracked lips and remembered the first time he'd called me daughter. It wasn't at my wedding to his son James 12 years ago. It wasn't when I'd cooked my first Thanksgiving dinner for the family. It was 4 years ago, when James had announced he'd been offered a position overseas, and without hesitation, I'd told him to take it while I stayed behind to care for Walter. "You're sacrificing too much," Walter had said that night, his voice already beginning to slur from the disease. "It's not a sacrifice when it's family," I'd replied. He'd reached for my hand then, his fingers already betraying the tremors that would eventually consume him. "You're a daughter to me, Caroline, more than blood could ever make you." A soft knock at the door pulled me from the memory. I looked up to see James's sister Diane standing in the doorway. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her designer clothes pristine despite the 6-hour flight she must have taken to get here from New York. Behind her loomed her husband, Richard, his perpetual frown deepening the lines around his mouth. "Is he—" Diane didn't finish the question, her eyes fixed on her father. "Not yet," I said quietly. "But soon." Diane nodded stiffly and stepped into the room, Richard following like a shadow. They positioned themselves on the opposite side of the bed, as though we were adversaries meeting across a battlefield with Walter caught in the middle. "Where's Travis?" I asked, referring to Walter's youngest child. "On his way," Diane replied, not meeting my eyes. His flight was delayed. The room lapsed into uncomfortable silence, broken only by Walter's labored breathing. I continued to stroke his hand, whispering reassurances, while Diane and Richard stood like sentinels, barely moving, barely speaking. It had always been this way with Walter's children. Distant, formal. They visited twice a year at most, usually around the holidays, staying at hotels instead of the house despite the 4 empty bedrooms. They called dutifully on birthdays and Father's Day, conversations lasting exactly long enough to satisfy obligation. When Walter had been diagnosed with Parkinson's 4 years ago, they'd suggested top-tier care facilities, their checkbooks ready, their schedules too demanding for anything more personal. But Walter hadn't wanted to leave his home of 40 years, the house he'd shared with his late wife, Eleanor. The garden where he could sit and watch the birds at the feeders I'd hung for him, the familiar creaks of the floorboards and the way the afternoon light slanted through the kitchen windows. "I don't want to die among strangers," he'd told me. So, I'd made my choice. James had taken the position in Singapore, flying back for 1-week visits every few months. I'd moved into Walter's house, converted the downstairs study into a bedroom as his mobility declined, learned to administer medications, and mastered the art of lifting a grown man without hurting either of us. I'd become his caregiver, his advocate, his confidant, and in many ways, his closest family. The sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway announced Travis's arrival. At 36, he was the youngest of Walter's 3 children, and the only one who occasionally showed genuine affection for his father. He burst into the room, his hair disheveled, his eyes wild with the fear of being too late. "Dad!" he breathed, rushing to the bedside. Walter's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his son's voice. A faint smile ghosted across his lips. "You made it," I said softly to Travis, relief flooding through me. At least Walter would have all his children around him in his final moments. Travis nodded, too choked up to speak. He took his father's other hand, and for a brief moment, I felt a kinship with him that I'd never experienced with the others. We were both genuinely grieving, both dreading the inevitable moment that was approaching. James was the last to arrive, slipping into the room just as the sun began to set. His face was haggard from the 20-plus-hour flight from Singapore, but his eyes were clear and focused as they found mine across the bed. I tried to smile, to offer some comfort, but my lips trembled with the effort. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Not long now," I replied. He nodded and moved to stand beside me, his hand finding my shoulder in a gesture that was both comforting and apologetic. In the 4 years since he'd taken the position abroad, our marriage had become something abstract, existing more in theory than in practice. We were companions bound by circumstance and history rather than passion, or even daily sharing of lives. I didn't blame him for it. We both had made our choices. Walter's breathing changed suddenly, becoming more erratic. The hospice nurse, who had been checking in periodically, entered the room as if summoned by some invisible signal. She checked Walter's pulse and nodded solemnly. "It's time," she said gently. "If there's anything you want to say to him, say it now. He can still hear you." One by one, his children leaned down to whisper their goodbyes. Diane's was formal, almost rehearsed. Travis's was emotional, tears streaming down his face as he promised his father he'd make him proud. James spoke quietly in his father's ear for a long moment, then kissed his forehead. When it was my turn, I leaned close, my lips nearly touching Walter's ear. "Thank you for being my father," I whispered. "For the chess games and the gardening, lessons, and for trusting me with your care. I'll miss our talks and your terrible jokes, and the way you always saved the crossword puzzles for us to do together. I love you, Walter." His fingers twitched in mine, a barely perceptible squeeze that might have been involuntary but felt like acknowledgement. Then, between one moment and the next, Walter Sheffield took his final breath, his chest rising and falling one last time before becoming still. The room grew very quiet. The nurse stepped forward, checked for a pulse, and gently closed Walter's eyes. "He's gone," she confirmed softly. "I'm very sorry for your loss." I felt the tears come then, hot and relentless. 4 years of daily care, of intimate conversations, of shared meals and quiet companionship, ended. The void left behind seemed vast and echoing. James put his arm around me, his own tears silent but present. Travis sobbed openly, unashamed of his grief. Diane dabbed carefully at her eyes with a tissue, her makeup remaining intact. Richard checked his watch. The next few hours passed in a blur of necessary tasks. The nurse called the funeral home. The funeral home sent people to collect Walter's body. Papers were signed. Belongings were gathered. Somewhere in the midst of it all, I found myself sitting alone in the kitchen, staring at the teacup Walter had used yesterday morning. Caroline. I looked up to see Diane standing in the doorway, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. "We need to discuss arrangements," she said. I nodded tiredly. "Of course. I know Walter wanted to be cremated. He has a plot next to Eleanor at Oakwood Cemetery. He picked out his urn years ago. It's in the hall closet with his important papers." Diane's lips thinned. "Yes, well, as the family, we'll be making those decisions." The emphasis on family wasn't subtle. I felt a chill run through me. "Walter left detailed instructions," I said carefully. "I'm happy to show you the file." "That won't be necessary," Diane replied. "Richard is an attorney, as you know. He'll be handling Father's estate and the funeral arrangements. We've already contacted Brightwood Funeral Home." "Brightwood?" I frowned. "But Walter specifically didn't want them. He said they overcharge, and— Caroline, Diane cut me off sharply. I understand you've been involved in Father's care, and we appreciate that. But now that he's gone, it's time for the family to take over. There it was again. Family. The word wielded like a weapon to exclude me. I am family, I said quietly. I've been Walter's daughter-in-law for 12 years and his primary caregiver for the last 4. Diane's smile was cold. Yes, and we're grateful for your assistance. But blood matters in these situations. I'm sure you understand. Before I could respond, Travis appeared in the doorway, his eyes red-rimmed but his expression determined. Diane, stop it, he said firmly. Caroline has been here every day for 4 years. Dad trusted her completely. She was the hired help, Richard interjected, appearing behind Travis. A well-loved one, certainly, but let's not confuse roles here. Hired help, I echoed, stunned. I wasn't paid a cent. I did it because I loved him. Of course you did, Diane said in a tone that suggested the opposite. And I'm sure Father provided for you adequately. The implication hung in the air like a noxious gas. They thought I'd been caring for Walter for financial gain, for inheritance. The idea was so absurd, so insulting, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. James chose that moment to join us, his face drawn with exhaustion and grief. He looked between us, sensing the tension. What's going on? He asked. Your wife seems to think she should be making the funeral arrangements, Diane replied smoothly. I was explaining that as Father's children, that responsibility falls to us. James frowned. Caroline knew Dad better than any of us these past few years. If she says he had specific wishes, we should honor them. A flicker of warmth bloomed in my chest at his defense, but Diane was unmoved. James, you've been gone. You don't understand the situation here. Father was declining mentally toward the end. Any instructions he gave Caroline might not reflect his true wishes. The accusation was clear. I felt my cheeks burn with indignation. Your father was sharp until the very end, I said firmly. He completed the New York Times crossword puzzle just last week. He beat me at chess 3 days ago. Regardless, Richard cut in. As the executor named in Walter's will, Diane has legal authority here. The arrangements have already been set in motion. I looked at James, hoping for support, but his exhaustion was evident. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as surrender. Let's not fight, he said wearily. Dad wouldn't want that. Diane, if you've already contacted Brightwood, fine. But let's at least consider what Caroline says about Dad's wishes for the service. Diane's smile was triumphant. Of course, brother dear. We'll take everything into consideration. But her eyes, cold and calculating as they met mine, told a different story. Over the next few days, I watched helplessly as Walter's children dismantled his final wishes piece by piece. The simple service he'd wanted became an elaborate affair with expensive flowers he would have hated. The cremation was delayed for an open casket viewing he had explicitly said he didn't want. The memory board I'd prepared with photos from his life was relegated to a back corner, replaced by formal portraits that showed none of his warmth or humor. I tried to intervene, to advocate for what I knew Walter would have wanted, but I was systematically sidelined. When I arrived at the funeral home for the planning meeting, I was told it had been rescheduled. When I called the cemetery about the plot, I was informed that the family had already handled it. When I offered Walter's favorite songs for the service, Diane selected traditional hymns instead, despite Walter's well-known preference for jazz. James, caught between loyalty to his siblings and to me, tried to mediate, but ultimately deferred to Diane. It's easier this way, he told me, one night as we lay in bed, not touching. Diane's always been like this. She needs to control everything. Once the funeral is over, we can go back to Singapore and leave all this behind. But I couldn't leave it behind. Every deviation from Walter's wishes felt like a betrayal of the man who had become a true father to me, of the trust he had placed in me, of the countless conversations we'd had about his end-of-life preferences. The funeral itself was a surreal experience. I sat in the front row beside James, surrounded by people I barely recognized: Walter's business associates, Diane and Richard's country club friends, distant relatives who had never once visited during his illness. The eulogy, delivered by Richard rather than any of Walter's children, portrayed a man I hardly knew, a shrewd businessman, a pillar of the community, a generous donor to the right causes. There was no mention of his dry wit, his passion for gardening, his terrible singing voice that he used unabashedly during our road trips, or the tenderness with which he had once cared for Eleanor through her own final illness. After the service, there was a reception at Diane and Richard's hotel. I moved through it like a ghost, accepting condolences from strangers who had no idea of the daily reality of Walter's life and death. Several times, I overheard snippets of conversation that made my skin crawl. Such a shame his own children couldn't care for him. That daughter-in-law must have had her reasons for staying. Wonder what she expects to get out of the will. It was Travis who found me on the hotel balcony, staring out at nothing, an untouched glass of wine in my hand. "I'm sorry," he said simply, coming to stand beside me. "For what?" I asked, though I knew. "For all of this?" He gestured vaguely back toward the reception. "For Diane and Richard. For not standing up to them more, for not being there these past 4 years the way you were." I nodded, accepting his apology because I was too tired to do anything else. "Dad loved you," Travis continued. "Really loved you. He told me that once when I visited last year, said you were the daughter he'd always wanted." The tears came again, unexpected and overwhelming. Travis awkwardly patted my shoulder. "There's going to be a reading of the will tomorrow," he said quietly. "At Richard's office, 10 o'clock. I nodded, wiping at my eyes. "I'll be there." Travis hesitated, then added, "Just prepare yourself, okay? Richard's been handling Dad's estate for years, and Diane, well, you know how she is." The warning hung between us, unfinished but clear. That night, unable to sleep, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake James. I went to the window of our hotel room and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere in that sea of twinkling brightness was Walter's house, my home for the past 4 years. I'd left it in a hurry after his death, grabbing only essential items as Diane had made it clear she wanted to secure the property. What would happen to it now? To the garden I'd planted? To the chess set that still sat on the side table, our last game unfinished? To the books we'd read together, my voice growing hoarse as his Parkinson's made it difficult for him to turn. Pages? A deep sense of foreboding settled over me as I thought about the will reading tomorrow. I wasn't naive. I knew how these things often went with blended families. But surely Walter had acknowledged our relationship, the care I'd provided, the bond we'd formed. Surely he wouldn't have left me completely vulnerable. As dawn broke over the city, I made a decision. Whatever happened at the will reading, I would face it with dignity. I owed Walter that much. I would be the daughter he had claimed me to be, strong, principled, unwavering, and I would find a way to honor his true wishes, even if I had to. Do it alone. I didn't know then how severely my resolve would be tested in the hours to come, or that beneath the grief and the family politics lay a secret that would change everything. A final testament far more powerful than anything written in legal documents. I didn't know that Walter Sheffield, even in death, had one last move to make in our unfinished game. The offices of Blackwell and Associates occupied the entire 32nd floor of a gleaming downtown high-rise. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city, while the reception area's marble floors and leather furniture announced success in the understated way of old money. I arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in a simple black dress that suddenly felt inadequate among such opulence. "Mrs. Sheffield?" The receptionist's smile was practiced and perfect. "The others are already in the conference room. Follow me, please." I trailed behind her through a maze of hushed corridors until we reached a set of heavy oak doors. She pushed them open to reveal a long table around which sat Walter's children, James, Diane, and Travis, along with Richard, who stood at the head of the table shuffling papers importantly. 4 other people I didn't recognize were also present, their expressions professionally somber. "Ah, Caroline." "Glad you could join us," Richard said without looking up. His tone suggested I was an optional participant rather than Walter's daughter-in-law. "Of 12 years." James rose halfway from his seat, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. As I sat down, I felt Diane's eyes on me, cold and assessing. Travis offered a small smile from across the table, but quickly looked away when Diane glanced in his direction. "Now that everyone is present," Richard began, "we can proceed with the reading of Walter Sheffield's last will and testament." He adjusted his glasses and continued in his practiced courtroom voice. "I'll introduce our witnesses. Mr. Graham Blackwell, senior partner at Blackwell & Associates. Ms. Elaine Chen, notary public. And Mr. Marcus Wells and Ms. Patricia Hogan, partners at Sheffield Enterprises." I knew of Sheffield Enterprises, of course, the company Walter had built from the ground up, transforming a small manufacturing business into a regional powerhouse. He'd retired as CEO 10 years ago, but had maintained a position on the board until his Parkinson's made attendance at meetings too difficult. Richard cleared his throat. "Before I begin, I should note that this will was updated and executed 14 months ago, with Walter of sound mind and in the presence of witnesses." 14 months ago. My stomach clenched. 14 months ago, Walter had been hospitalized with pneumonia, a complication of his Parkinson's. He'd been desperately ill, in and out of consciousness for nearly 2 weeks. During that time, Diane and Richard had flown in, the only time they'd visited outside of holidays in the 4 years I'd been caring for Walter. I remembered coming back to the hospital after a quick trip home to shower and change clothes, only to find Richard alone with Walter, a sheaf of papers on the bedside table. When I'd asked what was happening, Richard had smoothly explained they were just reviewing some routine business matters, while Walter was lucid. Walter never mentioned signing a new will after that. But then, why would he? We'd had more immediate concerns: his recovery, his physical therapy, adjusting his medications to account for his decreased lung function. Richard began to read, the formal legal language washing over me in waves that slowly resolved into comprehension. Walter's estate was substantial. I'd known that much, though I'd never concerned myself with the details. The will methodically distributed his assets. The bulk of Sheffield Enterprises shares were divided among his 3 children, with Diane receiving 40%, James 35%, and Travis 25%. His investment portfolio, worth several $1,000,000, was similarly divided. His vacation property in Maine went to James. His art collection, which included several valuable pieces, went to Diane. His vintage car collection went to Travis, and then came the part I'd been bracing for. Regarding the primary residence at 1428 Oak Hill Drive, Richard read, his voice taking on a subtle note of satisfaction, "I leave this property, along with all its contents, to my daughter, Diane Sheffield Blackwell." The air seemed to vanish. From my lungs. The house. Walter's house. My home for the past 4 years. Given to Diane, who had visited perhaps 6 times in as many years. "As for financial provisions," Richard continued, "I leave the sum of $100,000 to each of my grandchildren for their education. Walter had 5 grandchildren, 2 from Diane, 3 from James, none from Travis, who remained unmarried." To my loyal employees at Sheffield Enterprises, I leave a bonus of 1 month's salary for each year of service. Richard paused, adjusting his glasses as if preparing for a significant announcement. To my daughter-in-law, Caroline Sheffield, he read, I leave the sum of $20,000 in recognition of her assistance during my illness. $20,000. Assistance. My mind struggled to process the words, so clinical, so devoid of any acknowledgement of what the past 4 years had actually entailed, of the countless nights I'd sat up with Walter during pain flares, of the research I'd done into experimental treatments, of the modifications I'd made to the house to accommodate his changing needs, of the friends I'd lost touch with, the career I'd put on hold, the marriage that had drifted into something unrecognizable. $20,000. Less than minimum wage for the round-the-clock care I'd provided. Less than the cost of 3 months in the nursing facility Walter had adamantly refused. But it wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. It was about the message. This will sent that I had been an employee, not family. That the bond Walter and I had formed, the trust we'd built, the love we'd shared, meant nothing in the face of blood ties. I became aware that everyone was looking at me, gauging my reaction. I kept my face carefully blank, though my hands, clasped tightly in my lap, trembled slightly. The remainder of my estate, Richard continued, including all other properties, accounts, and investments not specifically designated herein, I leave, to my children, Diane, James, and Travis, to be divided equally among them. And with that, it was done. Walter's life, his legacy, reduced to a distribution of assets that bore no resemblance to the man I had known and loved. Are there any questions? Richard asked, looking around the table but carefully avoiding my eyes. Yes, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. Is there a letter? Walter mentioned he was writing personal letters to be read after his death. Richard's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. No letters were filed with the will. But he told me. If such letters exist, Richard cut me off, they weren't part of the legal documentation. Now, if there are no further questions about the will itself. Actually, Travis spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. I have a question. When exactly was this will signed? What was the specific date? Richard shuffled through the papers. February 17th of last year. Travis's eyes met mine briefly. That had been during Walter's hospitalization, just as I'd suspected. And who witnessed the signing? Travis pressed. Myself and Mr. Blackwell, Richard replied smoothly. As is perfectly legal and proper. When Dad was in the hospital, Travis said, heavily medicated for pneumonia. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. Your father was perfectly lucid when he signed. The attending physician confirmed his competence. All proper protocols were followed. I'm sure they were, Travis muttered, but subsided into silence. The meeting concluded shortly thereafter, with Richard distributing copies of the will and explaining the timeline for the execution of its provisions. As people began to rise from their seats, Diane approached me, her expression a mask of practiced sympathy. Caroline, she said, just loudly enough for others to hear, I want you to know how much we appreciate everything you did for Daddy. The $20,000 is just a token, of course. We know your care was never about money. The condescension in her voice was unmistakable. I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had the privilege of calling Walter Daddy, but had exercised it so rarely in his final years. No, I said finally. It wasn't about money. Nevertheless, Diane continued undeterred, we'll need you to vacate the house by the end of the month. Richard and I are planning to put it on the market, and it will show better empty. The end of the month, I repeated. That's less than 2 weeks. Diane's smile didn't falter. I'm sure that won't be a problem. After all, you and James have your own place in Singapore, don't you? And since you're not working, there's really nothing keeping you here, except memories. except the garden I'd planted, except the neighbors who had become friends, except the life I'd built while caring for Walter. I understand, I said, because what else could I say? The house wasn't mine. It never had been. James appeared at my side, his face unreadable. Ready to go? He asked quietly. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak further. As we turned to leave, Travis caught up with us in the hallway, his expression troubled. Caroline, James, can we talk? Privately? James checked his watch. We have a lunch reservation at... Cancel it, Travis said, with uncharacteristic firmness. This is important. Something in his tone made James hesitate, then nod. Fine. Where? Not here. Travis glanced over his shoulder. There's a coffee shop a block down. Meet me there in 15 minutes. Without waiting for a response, he strode down the hall toward the elevators. In the taxi on the way to the coffee shop, James finally broke the silence. Are you okay? It was such an inadequate question that I almost laughed. No, I said honestly. I'm not. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know the will was a shock, but 20,000 isn't nothing, Caroline. I turned to stare at him. Do you really think this is about money? Then what is it about? He asked, sounding genuinely perplexed. It's about the fact that your father and I became incredibly close over the past 4 years, and that doesn't reflect our relationship at all. It's about the fact that the house I've called home is being sold out from under me. It's about the fact that I gave up everything, my career, my friends, time with you, to care for your father, and I'm being treated like hired help. James had the grace to look ashamed. Caroline, did you know? I asked suddenly. About the will? About what Richard and Diane did when your father was in the hospital? No, he said, but too quickly, not meeting my eyes. James. He sighed. Again. I knew they were updating some paperwork. I didn't know the details, but he hadn't asked, hadn't intervened, hadn't considered how it might affect me. The realization settled over me like a weight, adding to the growing distance between us. The coffee shop was crowded, but Travis had secured a table in the back corner. As we approached, I noticed he had a leather portfolio open in front of him, several documents spread out on the table. Sit, he said, gesturing to the empty chairs. I've ordered coffee. Once we were settled, Travis leaned forward, his voice low. Something's not right about Dad's will. James shifted uncomfortably. Travis, don't start. The will is legal. Richard made sure of that. I'm sure he did. Travis replied dryly. That's what concerns me. He pulled out a document from his portfolio and slid it across the table. This is a copy of Dad's will from 3 years ago, the one he had in place before he got sick. I stared at the document. How did you get this? Dad gave it to me, Travis said. When he first got his diagnosis, he wanted me to know what his wishes were, in case things move quickly. He tapped the paper. Take a look at the provisions for you, Caroline. I scanned the document, my heart pounding as I found the relevant section. To my daughter-in-law, Caroline Sheffield, it read, I leave the house at 1428 Oak Hill Drive to be her residence for as long as she wishes, in recognition of her unwavering support and love. Upon her death, or should she choose to sell the property, the proceeds are to be divided equally among my children. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. This was the Walter I knew. The man who understood that the house had become my home. Who wanted to protect me. Who saw me as family. There's more, Travis said gently. Keep reading. I blinked away the tears and continued. I also leave to Caroline the sum of $1 million to be held in trust and dispensed according to her needs, whether for her own care or for the pursuit of her deferred dreams. $1 million. Not as a payment for services rendered, but as a father's gift to a daughter. To protect my future. to acknowledge the sacrifices I'd made. This, my voice caught. This is so different from what Richard read today. Travis nodded grimly. Exactly. And I don't believe for a second that Dad changed his mind about you. Not given how he talked about you, how grateful he was for your care. He pulled out another document. I also found this in Dad's study when I went by the house yesterday to pick up some photos for the memorial service. It was a letter, handwritten on Walter's personal stationery. The handwriting was shaky but legible. Walter's writing from maybe a year ago, before the tremors in. His hands became too pronounced. My dear children, it began. If you're reading this, I have passed on. There are things I need you to know, things too important to leave to legal documents alone. I read on, my heart in my throat. The letter outlined Walter's deep gratitude for my care, his concern that I had sacrificed too much, his explicit wish that I be provided for after his death. It mentioned the provisions he had made for me in his will, the house, the trust fund, and then came the most damning passage. If anything in my formal will contradicts these wishes, know that such changes would only have been made under duress or confusion. I have been clear and consistent in my desire to provide for Caroline, who has been more devoted than I could have asked. Do right by her, as she has done right by me. James sat back, his face pale. This isn't possible. Richard would never, wouldn't he? Travis asked sharply. With Diane pushing him? Think about it, James. The timing of the new will, when Dad was at his most vulnerable. The fact that they never mentioned updating it. The complete reversal of his wishes regarding Caroline. But that would be fraud, Travis finished. Undue influence at the very least. Possibly criminal. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what this meant. That Walter hadn't forgotten me. That he hadn't relegated me to the status of employee. That somewhere between his true wishes and the cold legal document read today, something had gone terribly wrong. What do we do? I finally asked. Travis closed his portfolio with a decisive snap. We fight. We challenge the will. We use this letter, the previous will, and anything else we can find to prove that the will read today doesn't represent Dad's true wishes. James paled further. That would mean going against Diane, against Richard. It would tear the family apart. The family is already torn apart, Travis replied bitterly. Has been for years. You've just been too far away to see it. James flinched at the accusation. I placed a hand on his arm, not in comfort, but in warning. James, if what Travis is saying is true, if your father was manipulated when he was vulnerable, don't. You want to know? Don't you want to make it right? He looked between us, conflict evident in his eyes. Finally, he sighed. What's your plan? He asked Travis. First, we need to secure Dad's study before Diane and Richard can get to it. There might be more evidence there. Then we talk to Dad's doctor from the hospital stay. Find out exactly how lucid he really was when he supposedly signed that new will. And we need to find out if there were any witnesses to Richard and Dad's interaction that day, besides the convenient Mr. Blackwell. James nodded slowly. I might be able to help with that last part. I have a contact at the hospital, an administrator I went to college with. She could check the visitor logs, maybe even the security footage if it's still available. For the first time since Walter's death, I felt a flicker of hope. Not for the money, not even for the house, but for the validation that the relationship Walter and I had built was real, that it had mattered to him as much as it had to me. There's one more thing, Travis said, his expression turning graver still. Something I found when I was going through some of Dad's old business files. He pulled out a final document, this one bearing the logo of Sheffield Enterprises. I think this might be the real reason Diane and Richard were so desperate to control Dad's will, and why they're in such a hurry to sell the house. He pushed the document across the table, and as I began to read, I realized that Walter's final legacy might be far more complicated and far more valuable than any of us had imagined, and that the battle ahead would be about much more than just my place in the family. It would be about justice for Walter himself. Mineral rights, I whispered, scanning the document Travis had placed before us. Walter owned mineral rights? Travis nodded grimly. Not just any mineral rights. These are for 3,000 acres in the Permian Basin. Dad purchased them back in the 70s when he was first expanding Sheffield Enterprises. The land itself wasn't worth much at the time, just scrubby desert in West Texas. But he had a hunch about what might be underneath. James leaned forward, his business instincts awakened. The Permian Basin is one of the most productive oil fields in the country now. If Walter owned mineral rights there, they could be worth a fortune, Travis finished, especially with the new extraction technologies developed in the last decade. Look at the last page. I flipped to the final sheet, where a geological survey dated just 6 months ago detailed the estimated reserves under Walter's holdings. Substantial deposits of oil and natural gas that could yield millions, possibly billions, over the lifespan of the field. Walter never mentioned this, I said, baffled that such a significant asset had never come up in our countless conversations. Because he didn't know, Travis explained. At least not until recently. The rights were part of an old portfolio he'd set aside decades ago when the initial explorations showed nothing promising. The technology wasn't advanced enough then to detect what was really there, but about 8 months ago, Harding Energy approached Sheffield Enterprises about conducting new surveys using their proprietary methods. And they found all this, James murmured, tapping the report. But why wouldn't Dad have told anyone? Travis's expression darkened. I think he did tell someone. Look at the routing slip attached to the report. I turned back to the cover sheet, where a small yellow slip indicated the document had been sent from Sheffield Enterprises to Walter's home address, with a notation in the corner. Copied to R. Blackwell per request. Richard knew, I said, the pieces clicking into place. And if Richard knew, Diane knew, James finished, his voice hollow with disbelief. Which explains their sudden interest in Dad's estate planning, and why they're so eager to sell the house now, Travis added. The deed to the house includes all mineral rights owned by the property holder. In Dad's original will, you would have controlled those rights for your lifetime, Caroline. The proceeds would have been substantial. But in the new will, James said slowly, the house and everything associated with it goes to Diane, who just happens to be married to the attorney, who facilitated the change, Travis concluded bitterly, and who is already planning to sell the property, probably to a shell company they control, to obscure the transfer of the mineral rights. I sat back, stunned by the scale of the deception. It wasn't just that I'd been cut out of Walter's will, I'd been deliberately removed to make way for Diane and Richard's scheme. Walter himself had been manipulated, his intentions subverted for profit. We need to stop them, I said, my shock giving way to anger. Not just for me, but for Walter. This isn't what he wanted. It won't be easy, Travis warned. Richard knows exactly how to make this look legitimate. The new will is properly executed, witnessed, notarized. Challenging it means proving Walter was incapacitated or under undue influence, which is notoriously difficult. But not impossible, James said with unexpected firmness. Especially if we can prove Richard and Diane knew about the mineral rights before the will was changed. That establishes motive. He pulled out his phone. I'll call my contact at the hospital now, see what she can find about Dad's condition during that stay and any visitors he had. While James stepped away to make his call, Travis and I continued examining the documents before us. There's something I don't understand, I said. If the mineral rights are so valuable, why weren't they explicitly mentioned in either will? Why attach them to the house? Travis's expression softened slightly. That might have been deliberate on Dad's part. He told me once that he never fully trusted Diane's husband. Thought Richard was too focused on appearances, on social climbing. By tying the mineral rights to the house and leaving you the house in the original will, he might have been trying to ensure those assets stayed out of Richard's direct control. The thought brought a fresh wave of grief. Walter trying to protect his legacy even after death, only to have those efforts undermined by the very people he'd been wary of. James returned, his expression a mix of excitement and trepidation. I got through to Melissa at the hospital. She can't access the records directly without a court order, but she confirmed something interesting. There was an ethics complaint, filed by a nurse during Dad's stay. Something about a patient being pressured to sign documents while medicated. The complaint didn't name Dad specifically, but the timing matches. She's going to see if she can find out more without raising any red flags. That's a start, Travis said. Meanwhile, we need to get into Dad's study before Diane and Richard can clean it out. There might be more evidence there. Notes about the mineral rights, perhaps even a copy of his original wishes. I still have a key to the house, I said. Walter never asked for it back after he died, but Diane made it clear I'm not welcome there. We don't need to ask permission, Travis said firmly. It's still legally the estate's property until the will is executed. As one of Dad's heirs, I have every right to enter the premises. And as my guests, so do you. James checked his watch. Diane mentioned at the will reading that she and Richard had an appointment with a real estate agent this afternoon. They shouldn't be at the house for at least a couple of hours. Then we go now, Travis decided, gathering his documents. And we find whatever else Dad left behind. The drive to Walter's house, my home for the past 4 years, felt surreal. So much had happened in the week since his death that I hardly recognized my own life anymore. As we pulled into the familiar driveway, I was struck by how unchanged everything appeared on the surface. The carefully trimmed hedges, the bird feeders I'd hung from the oak tree, the wicker chairs on the porch where Walter and I had spent countless evenings watching the sunset. But beneath that peaceful facade, secrets were buried, and we were there to unearth them. I let us in with my key, the familiar creak of the front door like a whispered greeting. The house smelled the same, a blend of lemon polish, old books, and the subtle notes of Walter's favorite pipe tobacco, which lingered months after he'd given up smoking at his doctor's insistence. Dad's study is this way, Travis said unnecessarily. I knew the house better than either of Walter's sons, but I let Travis lead, recognizing his need to take charge in this investigation. The study was as Walter had left it, bookshelves lining 3 walls, a large oak desk positioned to catch the afternoon light, framed photographs chronicling a life well lived. I moved immediately to the right corner bookshelf, where Walter kept his most important documents behind a row of leather-bound classics. He used to joke that it was his literary safe deposit box, I explained, carefully removing a complete set of Shakespeare's works to reveal a recessed compartment. Said no burglar would bother looking behind books these days. Inside the compartment was a small fireproof box. I knew the combination, Walter's late wife's birthday, and opened it to reveal a stack of neatly labeled folders: personal, medical, Sheffield Enterprises, estate planning. I handed the last folder to Travis, who began leafing through it with focused intensity. James, meanwhile, was examining Walter's desk, carefully opening drawers and sorting through their contents. Here, Travis said suddenly, pulling out a document. This is a letter from Dad's regular attorney, not Richard, dated 3 years ago, confirming the execution of his will. The one that left you the house, Caroline. It references an attached inventory of assets. He flipped through more pages, including the mineral rights. They're listed here as a separate line item with a notation. Currently low value, but potential for appreciation. So Walter's original attorney knew about the mineral rights, I said. But he didn't handle the new will? Apparently not, Travis confirmed. The letter also mentions that Dad had set up a series of video recordings, sort of a verbal will to accompany the legal document, explaining his decisions in his own words. Video. Recordings? James looked up sharply. Where would those be kept? I thought for a moment. Walter had a safe in the basement, behind the wine rack. He showed it to me once, said it was where he kept his irreplaceables. We moved quickly to the basement, where the temperature dropped several degrees and the smell of aged wood and concrete brought back memories of helping Walter sort through old family photographs, organizing them into albums during the long winter months of his illness. The wine rack, mostly empty now, as Walter had given up alcohol when it began interacting poorly with his medications, swung away from the wall on hidden hinges to reveal a small wall safe. Again, I knew the combination. Walter's own birthday, followed by Eleanor's, forming an 8-digit code that he'd said represented the sum of his existence. Inside the safe were several items: a velvet box containing Eleanor's wedding and engagement rings, a folder of birth certificates and other vital documents, and a small fireproof lockbox similar to the one upstairs. This one contained 3 labeled flash drives: for my children, business matters, and my true wishes. These must be the video recordings, James said, taking the drives reverently. Let's watch them here, Travis suggested. Dad kept a laptop in his study. We should see what's on these before we leave, especially if Diane and Richard might come back. We returned to the study, where James connected the flash drive labeled My True Wishes to Walter's laptop. After a moment, a video window opened, showing Walter seated in the very study where we now stood. The timestamp in the corner showed a date 3 years ago, shortly after his Parkinson's diagnosis, but before the disease had significantly impacted his appearance or speech. If you're watching this, video Walter began, his voice strong and clear, I've passed on. I've prepared this recording to ensure there's no confusion about my wishes, and to explain the decisions I've made in my will. He went on to detail the division of his business assets among his children, his specific bequests of personal items, and his hopes for the future of Sheffield Enterprises. And then he turned to the matter of the house. To Caroline, my daughter-in-law, but truly my daughter in heart. I leave my home at 1428 Oak Hill Drive, he said, his expression softening. Caroline gave up much to care for me in my final years, and this house became as much hers as mine during that time. It is my wish that she be able to remain here for as long as she desires. My vision blurred with tears as Walter continued. I have also established a trust for Caroline's benefit, administered by my attorney Samuel Weiss. This trust includes liquid assets and certain mineral rights which, while currently of modest value, may someday prove significant. I do this not as payment for her care. No amount could adequately compensate for the devotion she has shown, but as a father's gift to ensure she never faces uncertainty or hardship. Walter's image leaned closer to the camera, his expression becoming more intent. If any attempt is made to alter these provisions, if any subsequent will appears to contradict these stated wishes, I ask that this recording be considered evidence of my true intentions, made while I am of sound mind and free from any undue influence. The video continued for several more minutes, with Walter addressing each of his children directly, expressing his love and his hopes for their futures. But my mind kept returning to his explicit statement about the mineral rights, and the clear declaration that any changes to his wishes should be viewed with suspicion. When the recording ended, the 3 of us sat in stunned silence, the weight of what we'd discovered settling over us. This is exactly what we need, Travis finally said, his voice tight with emotion. Clear evidence of Dad's intentions, his specific inclusion of the mineral rights in your trust, and his warning about potential changes. With this, we can challenge the new will. But we have to move quickly, James added. Once Diane and Richard sell the house, the mineral rights go with it. It will be much harder to recover them after a sale. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text message from our neighbor across the street. Diane and Richard just pulled up. Thought you should know. They're here, I said, showing the others the message. We need to go. Now. We quickly replaced everything except the flash drives, which Travis pocketed. James closed the laptop and returned it to the desk while I made sure the hidden compartment behind the books was properly concealed. "Is there a back way out?" James asked, his voice tense. "Through the kitchen," I replied, leading them down the hallway just as we heard the front door open. "Ridiculous asking price, but the market's hot right now." Richard's voice drifted in from the entryway. "We should be able to close within 30 days, especially if we accept a cash offer." "I want it gone quickly," Diane replied. "I never liked this place. Too many memories." We slipped through the kitchen and out the back door, careful to close it silently behind us. From there, we made our way around the side of the house to where we'd parked on the street, safely out of view from the front windows. "That was close," Travis murmured as we drove away. "But we got what we came for." "What's our next move?" I asked, my heart still racing from our narrow escape. "We take this to a lawyer," James said decisively. "Not just any lawyer, someone specializing in estate disputes, someone with no connection to Richard or his firm." "I know just the person," Travis replied. "Rebecca Winters. She used to work for the DA's office prosecuting elder abuse and financial crimes. She's in private practice now, but she's built a reputation taking on exactly these kinds of cases." "Elder abuse?" I repeated, the phrase sending a chill through me. "Is that what we're alleging?" Travis's expression was grim. "That's exactly what this is, Caroline. Using Dad's vulnerability during his illness to manipulate him into changing his will against his clearly stated prior wishes. Exploiting his diminished capacity for financial gain. Yes, that's elder abuse. And if we can prove it, it's not just a civil matter. Richard could lose his law license. He and Diane could even face criminal charges." The realization that this had escalated beyond a family disagreement into potential criminal territory was sobering, but so was the evidence of deliberate manipulation we'd uncovered. Walter deserved justice, and so did I. "Can we meet with Rebecca today?" I asked. Travis checked his phone. "I'll try. Meanwhile, there's one more piece of evidence we should secure. James, did your hospital contact mention anything about visitors being recorded?" James nodded. "Standard procedure. All visitors have to sign in at the nursing station, and there are security cameras in the hallways and public areas." "Then we need those records and that footage," Travis said. "Specifically for February 17th last year, the day the new will was supposedly signed." "I'll see what Melissa can do," James replied. "But she warned me it might take a court order to access that information officially." "Rebecca can help with that too," Travis assured him. "Once we retain her, she can file for emergency injunctive relief to prevent the sale of the house pending investigation and subpoena the hospital records." As we drove toward Travis's apartment, where we would review the remaining flash drives and await word from Rebecca Winters, I found myself thinking about Walter, about the chess games we'd played in his study, his strategic mind teaching me to think several moves ahead. About his careful planning, his attention to detail, his determination to protect what mattered to him. It occurred to me that perhaps this final battle was Walter's last chess game, one he had anticipated and prepared for, placing pieces on the board that we were only now discovering. The video recordings, the documented mineral rights, the clear statement of his wishes, they were his opening moves in a game that would continue beyond his lifetime. And as his designated successor in this match against those who would subvert his true intentions, I was determined not to let him down. Diane and Richard may have made a bold move with their fraudulent will, but they had overlooked something crucial. Walter Sheffield had taught me well, and the game was far from over. What? None of us realized as we left Walter's house that day was that someone else had been watching our hasty departure. Someone who had their own interest in the outcome of this inheritance dispute. Someone who was about to introduce an entirely new dimension to the conflict, one that would test not just our legal strategy, but the very foundations of the Sheffield family itself. Rebecca Winters's office occupied the renovated top floor of a former textile factory downtown. Exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and industrial lighting created an atmosphere that was both professional and unpretentious. The woman herself matched her surroundings, practical, direct, with an underlying strength that was immediately apparent. "Let me make sure I understand the situation correctly," she said, after we had presented our evidence and explained our suspicions. Walter Sheffield executed a will 3 years ago, leaving his house and certain mineral rights to his daughter-in-law, Caroline. 14 months ago, while hospitalized with pneumonia, a new will was allegedly executed that redirected these assets to his daughter Diane, who was married to the attorney who facilitated the change. Now Walter has passed away, and Diane and her husband are rushing to sell the property, which would transfer the mineral rights potentially worth billions of dollars. "That's correct," Travis confirmed. "And we have video evidence of my father, explicitly stating his wishes regarding Caroline and warning against any attempt to change those provisions." Rebecca nodded, making notes on a yellow legal pad. "And you believe your father was incapacitated or under undue influence when the new will was signed?" "He was hospitalized with severe pneumonia," James said. "On medication that would have affected his judgment. And there's apparently an ethics complaint from that time period that might relate to his case." Rebecca looked up sharply. "An ethics complaint? From whom?" "A nurse at the hospital," I explained. "We haven't been able to access the details yet, but it was filed around the time the will was supposedly signed." "That could be crucial," Rebecca said. "Hospital staff are mandated reporters for elder abuse. If a nurse filed a complaint about Walter being pressured to sign documents while medicated, that's powerful evidence of undue influence." She set down her pen and leaned forward, her expression serious. "Before we go any further, I need to be clear about something. What you're describing isn't just a civil dispute over inheritance. If Richard Blackwell used his position as an attorney to manipulate a vulnerable client into changing his will for personal gain, that's professional misconduct at minimum, fraud at worst. And if he and Diane knowingly took advantage of Walter's diminished capacity, that could constitute elder abuse under state law." "We understand," Travis said firmly. "And we're prepared to pursue this as far as necessary to honor our father's true wishes." Rebecca studied each of us in turn, seeming to gauge our resolve. "All right," she finally said. "Here's what we need to do. First, I'll file an emergency petition to freeze any transfer of assets from Walter's estate, particularly the house. That will prevent Diane and Richard from selling it before we can resolve the will dispute." "How quickly can you do that?" James asked. "I can have it filed by the end of today. Given the circumstances and the evidence you've presented, we should be able to get a temporary restraining order within 48 hours. She made another note. "Second, we need to formally challenge the validity of the second will on grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity. For that, I'll need affidavits from Walter's regular physician about his cognitive state during that time period, and we'll subpoena the hospital records, including the ethics complaint and any security footage from the day the will was signed." "Will the court consider the video recording as evidence?" I asked, thinking of Walter's clear statements about his wishes. Rebecca nodded. "Absolutely. In fact, it's some of our strongest evidence. What Walter did, creating a contemporaneous record of his state of mind and intentions at the time of making his original will, was extremely wise. It's much harder for Richard and Diane to claim Walter changed his mind when we have him on video explicitly warning against that very scenario." "What about the mineral rights?" Travis asked. "Should we include their value in our filings?" Rebecca considered this. It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, establishing the true value of what was at stake helps demonstrate motive for Richard and Diane. On the other hand, once that information becomes part of the public record, it could attract unwanted attention and potentially more litigation. She tapped her pen thoughtfully. "Let's not lead with it, but be prepared to introduce it if necessary to establish motive. As we discussed strategy further, Rebecca's assistant knocked and entered with a steaming pot of coffee. As she poured cups for everyone, I noticed her glancing at Travis with more than professional interest. Travis, for his part, seemed oblivious, his focus entirely on the case at hand. "One more thing," Rebecca said after her assistant had left. "Have you considered the possibility that Richard and Diane might counterattack?" "What do you mean?" James asked. "Once they realize you're challenging the will, they might attempt to discredit you, particularly Caroline, since she stands to gain the most from overturning the second will. They could suggest she exerted her own undue influence on Walter during the years she cared for him." The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. "That's absurd. I know," Rebecca said, gently. "But they'll be desperate once they realize what's at stake. And desperate people can make ugly accusations. We should be prepared for that possibility." We left Rebecca's office 2 hours later with a clear plan of action. She would file for the temporary restraining order to prevent the sale of the house, begin the process of challenging the fraudulent will, and subpoena the necessary records from the hospital. Meanwhile, James, Travis, and I would gather additional evidence and prepare affidavits about our observations of Walter's mental state and his relationship with me. As we walked to the parking garage, Travis's phone rang. He checked the display and frowned. "It's Diane," he said, showing us the screen. "Should I answer?" "Put it on speaker," James suggested. "But don't let on that we're all here." Travis nodded and accepted the call. "Hello, Diane." "Travis, where are you?" Diane's voice came through, sharp with irritation. "I've been trying to reach you all day." "I've been busy," Travis replied vaguely. "What's up?" "Richard and I were at Dad's house earlier, and the neighbors mentioned seeing you there, with Caroline and James." The accusation in her tone was unmistakable. "What exactly were you doing in the house without our permission?" Travis's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "I don't need your permission to visit Dad's house, Diane. I'm his son, and the estate hasn't been settled yet." "That's not the point," Diane snapped. "You had no right to bring Caroline there. She's no longer welcome in that house." "According to whom?" Travis challenged. "Dad considered her family. She lived there for 4 years caring for him. She has more right to be in that house than you do." There was a moment of silence on the other end. Then Diane's voice returned, now glacially controlled. "Travis, I don't know what Caroline has been telling you, but you need to be careful. She's manipulative. She's always had her eye on Dad's money." James made a slashing motion across his throat, warning Travis not to reveal what we knew. "Is that so?" Travis said, his tone neutral. "That's not how Dad saw it." "Dad wasn't thinking clearly toward the end," Diane replied smoothly. "That's why he updated his will last year, to protect his assets from outside influences." "Outside influences," Travis repeated. "Interesting choice of words, Diane." "Look," Diane's voice sharpened again, "I'm trying to protect our family legacy. Dad worked his whole life to build something for us, his children, not for some woman who spent a few years changing his bedpans." I flinched at the crude dismissal of my relationship with Walter. James placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. "I have to go, Diane," Travis said, his own anger now evident in his clipped tone. "We'll talk later." "Travis, wait." He ended the call and stood for a moment, breathing deeply to compose himself. "Well," he finally said, "I guess they know we're up to something." "They don't know what, though," James pointed out, "and we should keep it that way as long as possible. We don't want to give them time to cover their tracks or fabricate counter-evidence." "Agreed," I said. "But we should warn Rebecca that they're already suspicious. They might try to move more quickly with selling the house." Travis nodded and sent a quick text to Rebecca, updating her on Diane's call. Almost immediately, his phone pinged with a response. "Understood. Expediting TRO filing now. Will update." When Judge signs. As we reached Travis's car, a sleek black sedan pulled up alongside us. The window rolled down to reveal an unfamiliar man in his 60s, distinguished-looking with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. "Travis Sheffield?" the man inquired. "And James and Caroline, I presume? My name is Edward Hargrove. I believe we have matters of mutual interest to discuss." We exchanged puzzled glances. "I'm sorry," Travis said cautiously. "Do we know you?" "Not yet," Edward replied with a slight smile. "But I knew your father quite well. I was his business partner in certain ventures, including those mineral rights you're so concerned about." My pulse quickened. This must have been the observer who had watched us leave Walter's house earlier. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private?" Edward suggested, gesturing to his car. "I have information about Walter's affairs that you'll find invaluable in your current situation." After a moment's hesitation and a silent conference of glances among the three of us, Travis nodded. "We'll follow you in my car. Where are we going?" "My office," Edward said. "It's not far from here." Edward's office turned out to be a penthouse suite in one of the city's most prestigious buildings, with panoramic views and decor that spoke of old money and refined taste. He led us to a comfortable sitting area and, without preamble, began to explain his connection to Walter. "Walter and I met at university," he said, pouring amber liquid from a crystal decanter into 4 glasses. "We lost touch for a while after graduation, but reconnected about 30 years ago when he was looking to diversify Sheffield enterprises. I was in natural resources then, still am, and I advised him on several investments, including those mineral rights in the Permian Basin." "So, you knew about the mineral rights all along," James said, accepting a glass but not drinking from it. Edward nodded. "Of course. I helped arrange the original purchase. At the time, it was a speculative investment at best. The technology didn't exist to extract much from that formation. But Walter had good instincts." He took a sip of his drink. "When Harding Energy approached Sheffield Enterprises last year about conducting new surveys, I was the one who liaised between them and Walter." "Did you know about the will?" I asked directly. "About Walter leaving me the house and the mineral rights?" Edward's gaze shifted to me, assessing. "Yes. Walter and I discussed his estate planning extensively. He was quite clear about his intentions regarding you, Caroline. He spoke of you with great affection and respect." "Then you must also know about the changed will," Travis said. "About what Richard and Diane did." A shadow crossed Edward's face. "I had suspicions. Walter called me after that hospital stay, sounding confused about some paperwork Richard had brought him to sign. He couldn't recall exactly what it was, but it troubled him. I suggested he review it with his regular attorney, but by then the documents had already been filed." "And you didn't investigate further?" James asked, a note of accusation in his voice. Edward set down his glass. "I tried. But Richard had been very thorough in limiting access to the new will. And shortly after, Walter's condition worsened significantly. It didn't seem kind to trouble him with legal battles when his health was failing. So why come forward now?" Travis challenged. "Why approach us in a parking garage like something out of a spy novel?" Edward smiled faintly. "Because yesterday I received this." He reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope, which he handed to Travis. It was delivered by Walter's attorney, his real attorney, Samuel Weiss, not Richard, with instructions to open it only after Walter's death and the reading of his will. Travis opened the envelope and unfolded a letter written in Walter's increasingly shaky handwriting from the later stages of his illness. He began to read aloud. "Dear Edward, if you're reading this, I am gone, and events have likely unfolded as I feared they might. Richard has been asking increasingly pointed questions about my mineral rights holdings, and Diane has suddenly developed an uncharacteristic interest in my estate planning. I suspect they know something about the Permian Basin properties that I don't. Perhaps the latest surveys showed even more promise than we anticipated. Should my original will be superseded by any subsequent document, particularly one executed, during my illness, I ask that you contact Travis immediately. He has always been the most clear-eyed of my children, the least susceptible to Diane's manipulations. Share with him everything you know about our business dealings, particularly regarding the mineral rights. In the event that my wishes regarding Caroline have been subverted, I entrust you with ensuring justice is done. Caroline has been a true daughter to me in ways Diane never was. She deserves the security I intended for her. You have always been a loyal friend and an honorable business partner, Edward. I trust you to be my advocate when I can no longer advocate for myself. With gratitude, Walter. Silence fell as Travis finished reading. Finally, Edward spoke again. Walter was an excellent judge of character, he said quietly. He knew exactly what might happen, and he prepared accordingly. He turned to me. He truly thought of you as his daughter, Caroline. In all our conversations about his final arrangements, his concern for your welfare was paramount. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I forced them back. Thank you for telling me that, for bringing us this letter. It means more than I can say. Edward nodded, then turned back to Travis and James. Now, gentlemen, we need to discuss strategy. I have considerable resources at my disposal, and significant influence with certain members of the judiciary who might be handling your case. I'm prepared to support your efforts to challenge the fraudulent will in any way I can. Why? James asked bluntly. What's your stake in this? Edward considered the question. Partly loyalty to Walter, partly a deep distaste for seeing someone like Richard Blackwell profit from elder abuse. He paused. And partly self-interest, I admit. Those mineral rights will be developed eventually. I'd much rather partner with honorable people like yourselves than with Richard and Diane. So, you're proposing some kind of business arrangement? Travis asked. Eventually, perhaps, Edward acknowledged. But first, let's focus on overturning this fraudulent will and securing Caroline's inheritance as Walter intended. Business discussions can wait. Before we could respond, Travis's phone buzzed. He checked it, and his face broke into a smile. It's Rebecca. The judge signed the temporary restraining order. Diane and Richard are legally prohibited from selling the house or transferring any assets from Walter's estate, pending a full hearing on our challenge to the will. That's the first step, Edward said approvingly. But Richard won't give up. Easily? He's too invested now. As if on cue, James's phone rang. He grimaced at the display. It's Richard. He put the call on speaker. James. Richard's voice was tightly controlled but vibrating with anger. I've just been served with a restraining order preventing the sale of your father's house. What the hell is going on? I think you know exactly what's going on, Richard, James replied calmly. We've discovered the truth about the will, about how you and Diane manipulated Dad into signing it when he was medicated and vulnerable. That's a serious accusation, Richard said, his lawyer's caution evident even through his anger, one that could be considered defamatory. It's not defamation if it's true, James countered. And we have evidence, Richard. Video recordings of Dad explicitly stating his wishes regarding Caroline and the house. Documentation of the mineral rights. Even a letter warning about attempts to change his will. There was a moment of silence on the other end. I don't know what game you think you're playing, Richard finally said. But you're making a grave mistake. Your father was of sound mind when he made his final will. He simply recognized where his true loyalties should lie, with his blood family, not with hired help. I felt a surge of indignation, but before I could speak, Edward leaned forward and whispered, "Let me." I nodded, and he took the phone from James. Richard Blackwell, he said, his cultured voice carrying an unmistakable note of authority. This is Edward Hargrove. I was Walter Sheffield's business partner and friend for 30 years. I'm aware, of every detail of his estate planning, including his true intentions regarding Caroline and those mineral rights you've been so eager to get your hands on. Hargrove? Richard sounded genuinely startled. What do you have to do with this? Everything, Edward replied smoothly. Walter anticipated your scheme, Richard. He left contingencies in place. Letters, recordings, witnesses. The truth will come out, one way or another. The only question is how much damage you're willing to absorb before you concede. Are you threatening me? Richard demanded. Not at all, Edward said. Merely outlining the inevitable consequences of your actions. The restraining order is just the beginning. Next will come formal depositions, discovery, subpoenas for hospital records and security footage. Your law partners will take notice. The Bar Association might become involved. Your reputation, your practice, your freedom, all at risk. You can't prove anything, Richard insisted, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. Can't we? Edward countered. The nurse who filed that ethics complaint about you pressuring Walter to sign documents while medicated. She remembers you quite clearly. The hospital security footage from that day still exists, and Walter's video testimony is quite compelling. There was another silence, longer this time. What do you want? Richard finally asked, his voice noticeably subdued. Edward caught my eye, silently asking for guidance. I nodded, giving him permission to negotiate on my behalf. A complete reversal. Edward stated firmly, the fraudulent will withdrawn. Walter's original wishes regarding Caroline honored in full. The house, the trust, the mineral rights, all as he intended. In return, perhaps we might be persuaded not to pursue criminal charges for elder abuse and fraud. Impossible, Richard snapped. Diane would never agree. Then Diane should consider the alternatives very carefully, Edward replied. We have a strong case, Richard, and unlimited resources to pursue it. How confident are you in your ability to withstand that kind of scrutiny? I need time to discuss this with Diane, Richard said stiffly. You have until tomorrow morning, Edward informed him. After that, we proceed with formal depositions and criminal complaints. Good day, Richard. He ended the call and handed the phone back to James. The four of us sat in silence for a moment, absorbing what had just transpired. Will they cave? Travis finally asked Edward. Richard might, Edward replied thoughtfully. He has more to lose professionally. But Diane? He shook his head. From what Walter told me about his daughter, she's not one to surrender easily, especially when there are billions at stake. Then we need to be prepared for a fight, I said firmly. For Walter's sake, and for justice. Edward smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through his composed exterior. Walter was right about you, Caroline. You have a strength he admired greatly. He raised his glass. To Walter Sheffield, a man who planned for every contingency, even from beyond the grave. As we toasted Walter's memory, I felt a sense of his presence, as if he were sitting with us, watching his final chess game unfold. The pieces were moving now. The evidence, the temporary restraining order, Edward's intervention, Richard's wavering, resolve. But the outcome remained uncertain. What I didn't yet realize was that there was another player about to enter the game. Someone none of us had anticipated. Someone with their own claim to Walter's legacy. And their arrival would change everything we thought we knew about the man I had called father. Morning arrived with no word from Richard or Diane. Rebecca had warned us not to expect an immediate surrender, but as the hours ticked by with no response, a sense of unease settled over me. It wasn't like Richard to miss a deadline, especially one with such significant consequences. Maybe they're just trying to make us sweat, Travis suggested, as we gathered in Rebecca's office for our planned 9 o'clock meeting. Psychological warfare. Rebecca shook her head, her expression troubled. Richard's too strategic for that. If he had a counteroffer, he would have made it by now. She checked her watch. Let's give them another 15 minutes, then proceed. As planned with the depositions. Edward, who had joined us for the meeting, sat quietly in the corner, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "There's another possibility," he said finally. "They might be preparing their own offensive." As if summoned by his words, Rebecca's assistant appeared in the doorway. "Ms. Winters, there's someone here insisting on seeing you. A Ms. Eleanor Sheffield. She doesn't have an appointment, but she's quite persistent." The name hit me like a physical blow. Eleanor, Walter's late wife's name. But Walter's wife had been dead for over 15 years. "Eleanor Sheffield?" Travis repeated, clearly as confused as I was. "That's impossible." "Not Eleanor Harrington Sheffield," the assistant clarified. "Eleanor Thorne Sheffield. She says she's Walter Sheffield's granddaughter." James and Travis exchanged baffled looks. "That's not possible," James said. "I don't have any children and Travis is unmarried. Diane's daughters are both teenagers, and their last name is Blackwell." "Show her in," Rebecca decided after a moment's hesitation. The young woman who entered the room was perhaps 25, with Walter's height and bearing, though little else in her appearance immediately suggested a family connection. Her hair was a rich auburn, her eyes a striking green. She carried herself with confidence, surveying the room with a directness that was somehow familiar. "Which one of you is Caroline Sheffield?" she asked without preamble. I raised my hand slightly. "I am." She studied me for a moment, then nodded as if confirming something to herself. "I'm Eleanor Sheffield, Walter's granddaughter through his son Michael." "Michael?" Travis echoed. "There is no Michael Sheffield." Eleanor's gaze shifted to him, cool and assessing. "And you would be—" "Travis Sheffield, Walter's youngest. And I can assure you, I only have 2 siblings, James and Diane." Eleanor smiled thinly. "That you know of." She reached into her bag and withdrew a manila envelope, from which she produced several documents. "My father, Michael Sheffield, was born in 1971 to Walter Sheffield and Catherine Thorne, before Walter's marriage to your mother. He was raised primarily by his mother, but maintained a relationship with Walter throughout his life." The room fell silent as we all absorbed this revelation. Walter had another son, a son none of us had known about. "That's absurd," James sputtered finally. "Dad would have told us if he had another child." "Would he?" Eleanor challenged. "From what I understand about your family dynamics, there wasn't much open communication. My father told me Walter kept him separate from his legitimate family, to avoid complications, especially with your mother, who apparently was quite traditional in her views." "Convenient story," Travis said skeptically. "And you're just showing up now, right after Walter's death, when there's an inheritance to claim?" "Actually," Eleanor countered, "I've been in contact with Walter for years. He knew exactly who I was. In fact, we had dinner together less than 6 months ago when I was in town for a conference." She turned to me. "He mentioned you, Caroline, said you were taking excellent care of him. That means something, coming from my grandfather." My head was spinning. If what she was saying was true, Walter had kept an enormous secret from all of us, a whole branch of his family unknown and unacknowledged. "Do you have any proof of this relationship?" Rebecca asked, her professional composure returning. "Birth certificates? DNA tests? Correspondence?" Eleanor handed over the documents. She'd been holding my father's birth certificate listing Walter as his father. A DNA test Walter and my father had done privately 10 years ago, confirming paternity with 99.98% certainty, and a stack of birthday and Christmas cards from Walter to my father spanning 40 years. Rebecca examined the documents carefully, her expression giving nothing away. "These appear legitimate," she said finally, "but they don't necessarily establish any right to Walter's estate. Was your father named in any of Walter's wills?" "No," Eleanor admitted. "Their relationship was private, though not secret. Walter provided financial support throughout my father's childhood and helped fund his education, but there was an understanding that my father would make his own way in life. "Then why are you here?" I asked quietly. "What do you want from us?" Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "My father died 3 months ago. Cancer. In his final weeks, Walter visited him several times. During one of those visits, Walter mentioned concerns about changes to his will, changes he said he didn't remember making. He told my father he was worried about the house and some mineral rights, and that he had intended them for you, Caroline." She reached into her bag again and produced a small digital recorder. My father recorded their last conversation. He was already very ill, and he wanted to preserve Walter's voice, their final moments together. But he captured something more important: Walter explicitly stating his true wishes regarding his estate. Without waiting for permission, she pressed play. Walter's voice, weak but clear, filled the room. "I'm worried, Michael. Richard brought me papers in the hospital last year. I signed them because he said they were urgent company matters. But now I'm not sure what they were. Diane's been asking about the house, about the mineral rights. I made provisions for Caroline. You'd like her, Michael. She's been a daughter to me these past years. But something's not right. I've tried to put safeguards in place, videos explaining my wishes, letters to Edward. But I'm afraid it won't be enough." Another voice, presumably Michael's, though frail and breathless. "Do you want me to do something, Dad? To help protect Caroline? Just, if anything happens to me, make sure the truth comes out. The house is hers. The trust with the mineral rights is hers. That was always my intention. I've tried to fix it, to revoke whatever I signed, but Richard keeps stalling, saying it's being handled. I don't trust him, Michael. I never have." The recording ended, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Eleanor turned to me. "My father made me promise to make sure his father's wishes were honored. That's why I'm here, not for money, not for recognition, but because Walter Sheffield was a man of integrity who loved my father in his own complicated way, and my father loved him enough to make this his final request." I stared at the young woman before me, seeing now the hints of Walter in her tall frame, in the set of her jaw, in the directness of her gaze. "I believe you," I said simply. "This recording," Rebecca interjected. "It's dated when?" 2 months ago, Eleanor replied. 3 weeks before my father died. About a month before Walter. "And you're willing to testify to its authenticity? To appear in court if necessary?" Eleanor nodded firmly. "Absolutely. I have nothing to hide, and neither did Walter or my father. This was a private family matter, not a shameful secret." Edward, who had been silently observing the entire exchange, finally spoke. "Walter mentioned Michael to me once, years ago. Said he had regrets about not being more present in his first son's life. I didn't press for details. It seemed too personal." "Did he ever mention Eleanor?" Travis asked. Edward shook his head. "Not by name. But about a year ago, he said something about being a grandfather again, in a different context than talking about Diane's or James's children. I assumed he was speaking metaphorically." "He wasn't," Eleanor said with a small smile. "He came to my doctoral graduation. Sat in the back, didn't make a fuss, but he was there. That was Walter's way. Present but unobtrusive in our lives." The pieces were falling into place, another dimension of Walter I'd never known, another layer to the man I'd thought I understood completely. But it felt right somehow, congruent with the Walter I'd known. A man of deep feelings and deeper commitments, who honored his responsibilities even when they were complicated, even when they remained largely hidden from the world. Rebecca cleared her throat. "This recording changes things. It's recent, clear evidence of Walter expressing that he believed he signed documents under false pretenses and reaffirming his true intentions regarding Caroline and the assets in question." Combined with our other evidence, it strengthens our case considerably. There's one more thing, Eleanor said, hesitating for the first time since she'd entered the room. Something Walter told my father about those mineral rights. Something that might explain why Diane and Richard are so desperate to get control of them. We all leaned forward slightly, tension crackling in the air. Walter discovered through recent geological surveys that the mineral deposits extend much further than originally thought, potentially under adjacent properties. Properties that Richard has been quietly acquiring through shell companies over the past year. How would Richard even know about the surveys? Travis asked. Because, Edward interjected grimly, Richard represents several clients with energy interests, including, if I'm not mistaken, Harding Energy, the same company that approached Sheffield. Enterprises about conducting new surveys on Walter's holdings. A conflict of interest, Rebecca said, her eyes narrowing. If Richard was representing both Walter and Harding Energy without proper disclosure. It's worse than that, Eleanor continued. Walter told my father he suspected Richard was using insider information from the surveys to guide his property acquisitions. If the mineral rights attached to Walter's house went to Caroline as originally intended, Richard's scheme would fall apart. He needed control of those rights to fully capitalize on his land purchases. That's securities fraud, Rebecca said sharply. Insider trading, criminal offenses. Which explains their desperation, I murmured, and why they can't afford to back down, even in the face of our evidence about the will. There's too much at stake. It also means they're unlikely to respond to our deadline, Edward observed. They're probably consulting with criminal defense attorneys right now. Rebecca's phone buzzed. She checked it, and her expression hardened. It appears you're right. Richard just filed an emergency motion challenging our temporary restraining order and claiming Caroline exerted undue influence over Walter during his illness, manipulating him into making promises about his estate. That's outrageous, Travis exclaimed. It's predictable, Rebecca corrected. A desperate counterattack to buy time and muddy the waters. She turned to Eleanor. Are you willing to go on record with what you've told us? To introduce the recording as evidence? Eleanor nodded without hesitation. That's why I'm here. My father made me promise to see this through. Walter deserves better than having his final wishes subverted by greed. Rebecca made a quick call to her assistant, issuing rapid-fire instructions, then turned back to us. We need to move quickly. I'm filing an amended complaint adding allegations of securities fraud and conflict of interest. Eleanor, I'll need a formal affidavit from you about the recording and what Walter told your father regarding the mineral rights and Richard's property acquisitions. What about Diane and Richard's counterattack? I asked, my stomach knotting at the thought of being portrayed as a manipulator, of having my relationship with Walter twisted into something calculated and self-serving. We address it head-on, Rebecca said firmly. We have multiple witnesses to your genuine care for Walter, his doctors, his nurses, neighbors, friends. And now we have Eleanor's testimony and the recording of Walter himself praising your devotion. She smiled slightly. Besides, their claim makes no logical sense. If you were manipulating Walter for financial gain, why would he need to hide his true intentions from Richard and Diane? Why the secret recordings and letters? As Rebecca, Eleanor, and Edward huddled to discuss strategy, Travis pulled me aside, his expression troubled. Are you okay? He asked quietly. This is a lot to process. Another branch of the family we never knew about. Accusations from Diane and Richard, the extent of their scheming. I took a deep breath, trying to center myself. I'm managing. It's overwhelming, but in a strange way it also feels right. Like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. I glanced over at Eleanor, who was gesturing animatedly as she explained something to Rebecca. She has Walter's directness, don't you think? That way of cutting straight to what matters. Travis studied his newly discovered niece. Yes, he acknowledged reluctantly. There is something familiar about her. I just can't believe Dad never told us. Maybe he tried, in his way, I suggested. Maybe there were hints we missed, openings for conversation we didn't take. James joined us, his expression thoughtful. I remember once, years ago, Dad mentioning regrets about choices he'd made before meeting Mom. At the time, I assumed he was talking about career decisions, investments. Now I wonder. Our conversation was interrupted by Rebecca's assistant appearing once again in the doorway, her expression strained. Ms. Winters? There's a Detective Morrison here from the Economic Crimes Unit. He's asking to speak with Richard Blackwell and says he was directed to this office. Rebecca's eyebrows shot up. The Economic Crimes Unit? Already? She glanced at Edward, who shook his head slightly, indicating this wasn't his doing. Show him in, Rebecca instructed quickly, rearranging her features into professional composure. Detective Morrison was a solid man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and the measured movements of someone who observed before acting. I'm looking for Richard Blackwell, he said without preamble. I was told he was meeting with Rebecca Winters regarding the Sheffield estate. I'm Rebecca Winters, she confirmed. But Richard Blackwell isn't here. We were expecting to hear from him this morning, but he hasn't made contact. The detective's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. When was the last time any of you spoke with Richard Blackwell or Diane Sheffield Blackwell? A chill ran through me at his tone. Yesterday afternoon, I said. Richard called James after being served with a temporary restraining order regarding Walter Sheffield's estate. I glanced at Edward. Mr. Hargrove spoke with him briefly. Detective Morrison turned his attention to Edward. And the nature of that conversation? We discussed the restraining order and our concerns about the validity of Walter Sheffield's most recent will, Edward replied carefully. I informed Richard that we had evidence suggesting the will had been executed under questionable circumstances, and that we were prepared to pursue the matter legally. Was there any mention of securities fraud or insider trading? The detective asked pointedly. Edward's expression registered surprise. Not explicitly, though we did reference certain mineral rights that were central to the dispute. I see. The detective surveyed the room, then seemed to come to a decision. I should inform you that early this morning, the SEC opened an investigation into Richard Blackwell for alleged securities fraud related to land acquisitions in the Permian Basin. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Blackwell and Mrs. Blackwell apparently left their residence in some haste. Their current whereabouts are unknown. They fled? Travis asked incredulously. We don't know that for certain, Detective Morrison replied. But their passports were used at a private airfield outside the city at 4:30 this morning. A private jet filed a flight plan for the Cayman Islands, where Mr. Blackwell is known to maintain certain financial interests. The implications settled over the room like a heavy fog. Diane and Richard hadn't been formulating a legal counter-strategy. They'd been planning their escape. The timing is suspicious, the detective continued. We'd received an anonymous tip regarding potential securities fraud, but before we could execute a search warrant, they were gone. I was hoping to speak with Mr. Blackwell directly, but it appears I'm too late. Eleanor stepped forward. Detective, I may have information relevant to your investigation. Walter Sheffield, my grandfather, told my father about his suspicions regarding Richard Blackwell's use of confidential geological survey data to guide property acquisitions in the Permian Basin. The detective's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of my grandfather, but he recovered quickly. I'd be very interested in hearing more about that, Ms. Sheffield. Eleanor Sheffield. Ms. Sheffield, perhaps we could speak privately? As Eleanor left with the detective, Rebecca turned to the rest of us, her expression grim but determined. This changes our approach. With Richard and Diane having fled, possibly to avoid criminal charges, their challenge to the temporary restraining order loses credibility. We should file a motion for summary judgment on the will contest, arguing that their flight constitutes an effective abandonment of their position. What about the house and mineral rights? I asked. Even if Richard and Diane are out of the picture, the fraudulent will is still the one on record. With the evidence we have, Walter's video statement, his letter to Edward, the recording Eleanor provided, and now Richard and Diane's flight to avoid prosecution, we have a strong case for having the court declare the second will invalid and the original will reinstated, Rebecca explained. Especially given Richard's apparent conflicts of interest and potential criminal behavior. How long will that take? James asked. It could be expedited under the circumstances. Possibly a matter of weeks rather than months. Edward had been quiet, his expression thoughtful. Now he spoke, his voice measured. There may be another approach. If, as the detective suggested, Richard was acting on an anonymous tip about securities fraud, it's possible the SEC's investigation will uncover evidence of the wider scheme, including the manipulation of Walter's will. You think the SEC might help our case? Travis asked skeptically. Not directly, Edward clarified, but their investigation could uncover documents, communications, perhaps even testimony from associates at Richard's firm who might have been aware of or involved in changing Walter's will. The more light shined on Richard's activities, the clearer Walter's true intentions become. Rebecca nodded slowly. It's worth pursuing. I have contacts at the SEC's regional office. I can reach out, make them aware of the will dispute as potentially related to their fraud investigation. As the conversation continued, my thoughts drifted to Walter. What would he make of all this? His secret son revealed to his other children. His granddaughter stepping forward to honor his wishes. His daughter and son-in-law fleeing to avoid prosecution for crimes committed in pursuit of his wealth. The key, complex web of relationships and motivations, of loyalty and betrayal that surrounded his final legacy. In life, Walter had been a meticulous planner, a strategic thinker who saw several moves ahead. Yet even he couldn't have anticipated every twist and turn of this final game. But perhaps in his wisdom, he had planted enough markers, enough breadcrumbs, to guide us to the truth in the end. Eleanor returned to the room, the detective having departed to continue his investigation elsewhere. Her expression was solemn but resolute. Detective Morrison believes there's a strong case against Richard, she reported, especially with the information about Walter's suspicions. He's going to coordinate with the SEC and push for international cooperation to locate Richard and Diane. What happens now? I asked, the question directed not to any one person but to the room at large. It was Eleanor who answered, her green eyes meeting mine with the same directness Walter had always shown. Now we do what my grandfather wanted. We make sure his true wishes are honored. We protect what matters. She smiled slightly. He believed in you, Caroline. My father said Walter spoke of you as the daughter he wished Diane had been. Compassionate, genuine, putting others before yourself. The words touched something deep inside me, a mix of grief and gratitude that brought fresh tears to my eyes. I just want to honor what he wanted, I said quietly. To be worthy of his trust. You already are, Eleanor replied. That's why we're all here. That's why Walter left so many breadcrumbs, so many fail-safes. He knew what kind of person you were, and he wanted to protect you, just as you protected him. As we gathered our things to leave Rebecca's office, each lost in our own thoughts about the path forward, I found myself standing beside the window, looking out at the city Walter had called home for all his life. Somewhere in that urban landscape was the house where I'd spent 4 years caring for him, the garden I'd planted for him, the rooms where we'd talked and laughed and sometimes simply sat in companionable silence. Whatever happened with the legal proceedings, with Richard and Diane's flight from justice, with the complex questions of inheritance and assets, one thing remained certain. Walter Sheffield had been a father to me in every way that mattered. And in the end, through his careful planning and the unexpected appearance of Eleanor, he had found a way to protect me one last time. The game wasn't over yet. But Walter's strategy was finally becoming clear, and his opponents were in retreat. I could almost imagine him sitting across from me at the chess table, that subtle smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he murmured, "Check." The next, 2 weeks passed in a blur of depositions, court filings, and revelations that continued to reshape our understanding of Walter's life and the depth of Richard and Diane's deception. Detective Morrison and the SEC investigators had obtained search warrants for Richard's office and home, uncovering a trove of incriminating evidence. There were encrypted emails between Richard and executives at Harding Energy discussing the geological survey results months before they were officially reported to Sheffield Enterprises. Spreadsheets tracking land purchases through various shell companies. And most damning of all, a draft memo on Richard's personal laptop outlining a strategy to secure WS mineral rights before true value becomes public knowledge. The discovery process for our will challenge had also yielded critical documents. Rebecca's subpoena to the hospital had produced not only visitor logs confirming Richard and Graham Blackwell's presence in Walter's room on February 17th, but also the complete ethics complaint filed by Nurse Martinez, who had witnessed Richard pressuring a heavily medicated Walter to sign papers. I objected to Mr. Blackwell's insistence that the patient sign documents while under the influence of pain medication, Nurse Martinez had written. The patient appeared confused and asked several times what he was signing. Mr. Blackwell told him they were routine company matters requiring immediate attention and that he shouldn't worry about the details. When I suggested waiting until the patient was more lucid, Mr. Blackwell stated that I was overstepping my role and implied he would speak to hospital administration if I interfered further. The complaint had been investigated at the time, but Richard had leveraged his connections with the hospital board to have it dismissed as a misunderstanding. Now, with Nurse Martinez's sworn affidavit supporting her original account, it provided compelling evidence of undue influence. But perhaps the most shocking discovery came from an unexpected source, Richard's secretary, Marlene Porter. I knew something wasn't right, she told Rebecca during her deposition. Mr. Blackwell was always so careful about client confidentiality, but after Walter Sheffield's hospital stay, he had me prepare a new will on an encrypted file instead of going through the normal document management system. I never saw the final version, but I did overhear him telling Mrs. Blackwell that the house and everything with it would be hers. Marlene had also revealed that in the days before their flight, Richard and Diane had been frantically shredding documents and transferring funds to offshore accounts. They were panicking, she said. I've worked for Mr. Blackwell for 15 years, and I've never seen him like that. Sweating, yelling at Mrs. Blackwell to hurry up. He kept saying, "If Caroline finds the recording, we're finished." The recording. Walter's final chess move. Today, we were gathered once again in Rebecca's office, waiting for news from the judge who was considering our motion to invalidate the fraudulent will and reinstate Walter's original intentions. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful, a stark contrast to the desperation of our first meeting just 2 weeks ago. "How are you holding up?" Travis asked, handing me a cup of coffee as we stood by the window, watching rain streak down the glass in silvery rivulets. "Better than I expected," I admitted. "There's something liberating about finally having the truth come out." Travis nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking a lot about Dad lately, about how much of him I never really knew." He glanced across the room to where Eleanor sat in conversation with James, their heads bent together in a way that highlighted the family resemblance neither had noticed before. A whole other life he kept separate from us, a son, a granddaughter. "Are you angry with him?" I asked gently. Travis considered the question. Not angry. Sad, maybe, that he didn't feel he could share that part of himself with us, that our family was so fractured. He sighed. "But I understand why he kept Michael separate. Mom was traditional, unforgiving. She would have seen Michael as a threat to her perfect family image. And Diane takes after her," I observed. "Always concerned with appearances, with status." "Exactly. which is what makes all of this so ironic. Travis gestured vaguely, encompassing the legal battle, Richard and Diane's flight, the unraveling of their carefully constructed facade. Diane was so obsessed with the family legacy, with controlling the Sheffield name and fortune, that she's destroyed her own reputation in the process. She's become exactly what she feared most: a scandal. The door opened, and Rebecca entered, her expression unreadable as she carried a thick envelope. We all turned to her expectantly, the room falling silent. "The judge has ruled," she announced, holding up the envelope. "I haven't opened it yet. I thought we should all hear the decision together." We gathered around the conference table. James, Travis, Eleanor, Edward, and myself, as Rebecca carefully opened the envelope and removed the judge's order. She scanned it quickly, her professional mask slipping as a smile broke through. "The court has granted our motion in full," she announced. "The will dated February 17th is declared invalid due to clear and convincing evidence of undue influence and diminished capacity. Walter's previous will is reinstated as his true and final testament." A wave of relief washed over me, so intense that for a moment I couldn't speak. Walter's true wishes would be honored. His house, my home, was mine. The trust fund with the mineral rights was mine. But more importantly, the relationship we had built, the bond we had shared, had been validated in the eyes of the law. "There's more," Rebecca continued, still reading. "The judge has referred the matter of Richard Blackwell's conduct to the State Bar Association for professional ethics review. And he's authorized a special master to oversee the recovery of any assets that Diane and Richard may have transferred or hidden prior to their departure." "What about the criminal investigation?" Edward asked. "The securities fraud?" "That's proceeding separately," Rebecca explained. "But the judge notes that his findings regarding the will may be considered relevant evidence in any criminal proceedings against Richard or Diane." "Have they been located yet?" I asked. The last we'd heard, Interpol had been alerted about their flight, but there had been no confirmed sightings. Rebecca shook her head. "Not officially, but there are rumors they've been seen in various banking havens: the Caymans, Switzerland, Singapore. Without an extradition treaty specifically covering financial crimes, it may be difficult to bring them back to face charges." "So they get away with it?" Travis asked incredulously. "Not entirely," Rebecca assured him. "They've fled the country, abandoned their home and possessions, left their reputations in tatters. Richard's law practice is finished, their social standing is destroyed, and if they ever return to U.S. jurisdiction, they'll face immediate arrest. It's not perfect justice," Edward acknowledged, "but it's something. And most importantly, Walter's true wishes for Caroline have been upheld." Eleanor, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "My grandfather would be pleased. He valued integrity above all else." She smiled at me. "He would be happy knowing his home is in good hands." After the meeting concluded, James, Travis, Eleanor, and I went to Walter's house, my house now, to celebrate the court victory and to begin the process of truly getting to know one another as the extended family Walter had always known us to be. The house felt different somehow, lighter, as if a shadow had been lifted. I moved through the familiar rooms, touching objects that held memories of my time with Walter. The chess set where he had taught me strategy, the books we had discussed, the throw blanket I had tucked around his shoulders on chilly evenings. Now, the kitchen. I prepared tea while the others settled in the living room, their conversation a gentle murmur punctuated occasionally by laughter. It felt right, having Walter's children and granddaughter together in this house that had been his sanctuary. As I waited for the kettle to boil, I noticed a small envelope propped against the fruit bowl on the counter. My name was written on it in Walter's shaky handwriting. I picked it up, puzzled. I had been in this kitchen every day. The envelope hadn't been there before. Opening it carefully, I found a single key and a note. "Caroline, If you're reading this, then somehow, against the odds, justice has prevailed. This key opens the compartment beneath the third step of the back staircase, the one that always creaked no matter how I tried to fix it. What you'll find there is for you alone. With love and gratitude, Walter. My hands trembled slightly as I read the note. Even now, weeks after his death, Walter was still reaching out, still guiding events from beyond the grave. I slipped away from the kitchen and made my way to the back staircase, a narrow flight of stairs leading from the mudroom to the second floor, seldom used except by me when I would bring laundry upstairs. The third step had indeed always creaked, a sound so familiar I had ceased to notice it. Kneeling on the second step, I examined the third. It looked ordinary, but when I pressed firmly on the front edge, I felt a slight give. Using the key, I was able to release a hidden latch, allowing the step to tilt upward like a lid. Inside the hollow space was a small fireproof box. I lifted it out, my heart racing with anticipation and a touch of trepidation. Using the same key, I opened the box to find a leather-bound journal and a smaller envelope with my name on it. I opened the envelope first. My dear Caroline, if you found this, then my worst fears about Diane and Richard's intentions have likely come to pass, but you have somehow managed to overcome their schemes. I'm sorry I couldn't be more direct with you about my concerns, but I was afraid of placing you in their crosshairs more than you already were. The journal contains the full story of my life, including the parts I kept hidden from most of the world. Michael, Eleanor, the mineral rights, my suspicions about Richard. I began writing it when I was first diagnosed with Parkinson's, thinking it would be a simple record for my family. It became something more, a confession, perhaps, or a testament, to the complicated, imperfect life I lived. I want you to have it because you, more than anyone, saw me for who I truly was in my final years. Not as a successful businessman, not as a failing body, but as a human being with regrets and hopes and fears. Know that the time you spent caring for me was the most peaceful of my life. Your compassion, your intelligence, your quiet strength, these were gifts beyond measure. Whatever the future holds for you, remember that you were loved, deeply and truly, by an old man who was fortunate enough to have you as his daughter, in all but blood. With eternal gratitude, Walter. Tears blurred my vision as I carefully folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. The journal beckoned, its worn leather cover suggesting years of entries, of thoughts and reflections I had never been privy to during our 4 years together. Caroline? Is everything okay? I looked up to see Eleanor standing at the bottom of the stairs, concern etched on her features. For a moment I saw Walter in her expression, the same furrow between the brows, the same direct gaze. Yes, I said, wiping away tears. Walter. Left me a letter, and his journal. Eleanor smiled softly. That sounds like him. Always planning ahead, always making sure the people he cared about were taken care of. She hesitated, then added, We were wondering if you'd like to join us. James and Travis are telling stories about grandfather that I never got to hear, and I have a few of my own to share. I carefully returned the journal to the box, knowing I would read it later, when I was alone and could fully absorb Walter's private thoughts. I'd like that, I said, rising and tucking the box under my arm. I have some stories too. Later that evening, after James, Travis, and Eleanor had departed with promises to return soon, I sat in Walter's study, my study now, and opened his journal. The first entry was dated shortly after his Parkinson's diagnosis, his handwriting, still strong and steady. I've been told I should put my affairs in order, he had written. A strange euphemism for preparing to die. But what does that really mean? Legal documents? Financial arrangements? These seem inadequate measures of a life. Perhaps what needs ordering most are not my affairs, but my truths. I read late into the night, absorbing Walter's private reflections. His account of meeting Catherine Thorne in college, their brief but intense relationship, his shock and fear upon learning she was pregnant, his parents' insistence that he focus on his future rather than throwing it away on an unsuitable match. He wrote of the guilt that haunted him for years afterward, of the tentative steps he took to be part of Michael's life without disrupting his marriage to Eleanor, of the complex compartmentalization that became his coping mechanism. He detailed his growing suspicions about Richard's character, his concerns about Diane's materialistic values, his regret that he hadn't been more direct in challenging both. And he wrote about me, pages and pages about the unexpected bond we had formed, the comfort he found in our conversations, the peace that came with being truly known and accepted in his declining years. Caroline sees me, he had written in an entry from 2 years ago. Not the successful CEO, not the wealthy patriarch, not the failing body, but the human being beneath all those labels. It is a profound gift to be seen so clearly and still be loved. As I closed the journal in the early hours of the morning, I felt a sense of completion, of coming full circle. Walter had entrusted me not just with his care in his final years, but with his unvarnished truth after his death. It was a responsibility I would honor, just as I had honored his trust during his illness. The following day, I received a call from Edward Hargrove. "Caroline," he said without preamble, "I've been speaking with some contacts in the energy sector about those mineral rights. There's significant interest in development, but I've held them off for now, pending your decisions." "My decisions?" I echoed, still adjusting to the idea that these valuable assets were now legally mine. "Yes," Edward confirmed. "As the trust beneficiary, you have considerable latitude in how those rights are developed, or not developed." Walter structured the trust that way deliberately. I thought about the implications, about the responsibility Walter had placed in my hands. "I need time to consider the options," I said finally. "I want to make decisions that honor Walter's values, not just his financial interests." "I understand completely," Edward replied, approval evident in his tone. "Take all the time you need. The minerals have been in the ground for millions of years. They can wait a bit longer." After ending the call, I wandered through the house, touching familiar objects, looking at photographs, feeling Walter's presence in every room. In the garden, spring flowers were beginning to emerge, crocuses and early daffodils pushing through the soil in vibrant defiance of winter's lingering chill. I knelt to clear away some dead leaves, my fingers working the cool earth as I had done so many times while Walter watched from his chair on the patio, offering suggestions and appreciation in equal measure. "The garden will outlive us all," he had said once. "That's the beauty of it. We plant, we tend, we enjoy for a season, and then others come after us to continue the cycle." Now I understood his words in a new light. Walter had planted seeds throughout. His life, his children, his business, his relationships. Some had flourished, others had struggled. But even in death, he had found a way to nurture what mattered most to him, to ensure that what he valued would continue to grow. The mineral rights were more than just valuable assets. They were Walter's legacy, his final gift to me. How I managed them would reflect not just on my financial acumen, but on my understanding of the man who had entrusted them to me. As I worked in the garden, my phone rang again. It was Rebecca. "I have news," she said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "Singapore authorities have detained Diane and Richard at Changi Airport. Apparently, they were attempting to establish new identities with forged passports. They're being held pending extradition discussions." A complex wave of emotions washed over me. Relief that they might face justice, sadness for the depths to which they had fallen, a strange sense of closure. "What happens now?" I asked. "It's complicated," Rebecca admitted. Singapore doesn't have an extradition treaty with the US for these specific financial crimes, but their use of forged passports creates a new criminal issue that might facilitate their return. Either way, they're no longer free to move about the world as they please. After we hung up, I sat in the garden for a long time, watching clouds drift across the spring sky, thinking about choices and consequences, about legacy and truth. Walter had faced his final years with dignity and courage, confronting not just his physical decline but the moral failings within his family. He had made provisions, left breadcrumbs, created fail-safes, all to ensure that justice would eventually prevail. And somehow, against the odds, it had. Not perfectly, not completely, but substantially. His true wishes for me had been honored. The truth about his extended family had come to light. Richard and Diane's schemes had been exposed, their flight from accountability compromised. In his final testament, not the legal document but the sum total of his actions and choices, Walter Sheffield had demonstrated the values he truly held: dear integrity, responsibility, and love that transcended conventional boundaries. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden he had loved, I made a silent promise to Walter. I would honor his legacy not just by protecting what he had left me, but by embodying the principles that had guided his life, especially in its final, most vulnerable chapter. The house, the mineral rights, the trust fund, these were valuable, certainly. But the true inheritance Walter had left me was something far more precious. The example of how to face life's complexities with courage, how to admit mistakes without being defined by them, how to love generously without expectation of return. That was the final testament of Walter Sheffield, and it was a legacy I would spend the rest of my life striving to deserve. 1 year to the day after Walter's death, I stood in the garden he had loved, now transformed by my own vision, yet still honoring his memory. The roses he had cherished were in full bloom, their fragrance carrying on the gentle October breeze. Beside them grew new beds of native wildflowers that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds, bringing life and movement to what had once been a more formal space. "He would have loved this," Eleanor said, joining me by the stone bench where Walter had spent countless afternoons in his final years. Grandfather appreciated beauty that had purpose. I smiled, watching as James's children raced across the lawn, their laughter echoing through the garden. Travis followed them, pretending to be a monster in some elaborate game they had invented. In the year since Walter's death, our unlikely family had grown closer, healing wounds both old and new. "The children are getting big," Eleanor observed, her hand unconsciously moving to her own slightly rounded belly. Her pregnancy, just beginning to show, had been a joyful surprise, another branch of Walter's family tree extending into the future. "They are," I agreed. "Walter would have enjoyed seeing them play here." The doorbell rang, and James went to answer it. He returned a few moments later with Edward Hargrove, who had become not just a business partner, but a dear friend over the past year. "Am I late?" Edward asked, looking around at the gathered family. "Right on time," I assured him. We were just about to begin. We had chosen this day, the anniversary of Walter's passing, to implement a decision that had taken months of careful consideration. After extensive consultations with environmental experts, community leaders, and energy industry specialists, I had made my choice regarding the mineral rights Walter had left me. Edward handed me a leather portfolio containing the final documents. "Everything is in order," he said. "The Sheffield Conservation Trust is officially established. The mineral rights are secured in perpetuity, with all proceeds from existing wells directed to environmental restoration and community development." It had been a bold decision, one that had raised eyebrows in the industry. Instead of allowing full-scale development of the mineral deposits beneath Walter's land, I had opted for a middle path, maintaining the handful of existing wells but placing the majority of the resources under permanent conservation protection. The proceeds, still substantial, would fund environmental initiatives and support the communities that had been Walter's home. "I still can't believe you turned down $3 billion, Travis said, joining us with his niece perched on his shoulders. "It wasn't really mine to sell," I replied simply. "Walter trusted me to be a steward, not just an owner." The doorbell rang again, and this time I went to answer it myself. Rebecca Winters stood on the doorstep, elegant as always in a tailored suit, a folder tucked under her arm. "It's official," she said without preamble as I invited her in. "Richard has accepted the plea deal. 10 years for securities fraud, wire fraud, and elder abuse. Diane got 7, with eligibility for parole after 4. After their detention in Singapore, it had taken 6 months of diplomatic negotiations to secure Richard and Diane's return to face justice. Their eventual extradition had made headlines, as had their trial, where the full extent of their scheme had been laid bare for public scrutiny. "How did they seem?" I asked, not out of malice but from a genuine curiosity about the people who had so nearly succeeded in subverting Walter's final wishes. "Defeated," Rebecca said after a moment's reflection. "The Richard Blackwell I saw in that courtroom was a shadow of the arrogant attorney who manipulated a vulnerable client. And Diane..." She hesitated. "Diane asked if she could write to James and Travis. Said she had things she needed to say to her brothers. That's for them to decide," I said, glancing through the doorway to where Walter's children, all of his children, had gathered in the living room. In the year since the court's ruling, James had returned from Singapore permanently, taking a FIL position at Sheffield Enterprises that allowed him to work alongside Travis in reshaping the company according to more sustainable, ethical principles. Eleanor had introduced them to Michael's research in renewable energy, creating unexpected synergies between Walter's traditional business and new technologies. As for me and James, our marriage had found a new equilibrium, not the passionate union of our early years, but something more mature, based on mutual respect and shared purpose. We had separate bedrooms in the house now, an arrangement that acknowledged the distance that had grown between us during his years abroad and my time caring for Walter. But we had family dinners, weekend projects, and a genuine friendship that seemed in many ways more honest than our earlier attempts at conventional marriage. When everyone had gathered in the living room, I stood before them, Walter's journal in my hands. "A year ago today, we lost Walter," I began. "But in many ways, we've found him in the months since, through his writing, through his planning, through the connections he forged that outlasted him." I looked around at the faces, James and Travis, whom Walter had raised, Eleanor, the granddaughter he had cherished from a distance, Edward, the friend who had honored his trust, Rebecca, who had fought for his true wishes, and the next generation, children who would know Walter only through our stories. "Walter left each of us something precious," I continued. "Not just material things, but pieces of himself. His wisdom, his flaws, his capacity for growth. He wasn't perfect. His journal makes that abundantly clear." I smiled, thinking of Walter's unflinching self-assessment in those private pages. But he faced his mistakes with courage and tried to make amends where he could. I placed the journal on the coffee table, where photographs of Walter throughout his life had been arranged in a timeline, from ambitious young businessman to proud father to the vulnerable but dignified man I had known in his final years. "Today we're establishing the Walter Sheffield Foundation," I announced. "Using a portion of the proceeds from the mineral rights, we'll fund scholarships for healthcare workers specializing in end-of-life care, support research into Parkinson's disease, and create resources for blended families navigating complex relationships." James stood up. "Caroline has already made the initial donation," he said. "But Travis, Eleanor, and I are matching it. This foundation will be our collective effort to honor Dad's legacy." We raised our glasses then, champagne for most, sparkling, cider for Eleanor, in a toast to Walter. As we did, a shaft of late afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the chess set that still sat on the side table where Walter and I had played our last game. Later, after the others had departed, I sat alone in Walter's study. My study now, though it would always carry his presence. I opened his journal to an entry he had written about 2 years before his death. I've been thinking about legacy lately. Not the kind measured in dollars or buildings with my name on them, but the kind that lives in the hearts and actions of those we've touched. If I've learned anything in my 76 years, it's that our true impact isn't in what we accumulate, but in what we give away, our time, our wisdom, our forgiveness, our love. Caroline asked me today what I hoped people would remember about me. I told her something trite about business achievements, but the true answer is this. I hope they remember that I tried. That when I failed, and I failed often, I acknowledged it and attempted to do better. That I loved imperfectly but sincerely. That in the end, I recognized what truly mattered. I closed the journal gently, Walter's words settling in my heart like a benediction. Outside, the garden was golden in the fading light, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. From somewhere in the house came the distant sound of the grandfather clock Walter had lovingly maintained, marking time's passage with the same steady rhythm it had kept throughout his life. In the year since his death, I had come to understand that Walter's final testament wasn't really about property, or mineral rights, or even justice served. It was about connections that transcended conventional boundaries, about truth that outlasted deception, about love that was stronger than greed or malice. Diane and Richard had seen Walter's estate as something to possess, to control. What they had never understood was that Walter's true legacy couldn't be captured in legal documents or bank accounts. It lived in the garden I tended, in the relationships he had nurtured, in the ethical choices his children now made in his memory. As twilight deepened into night, I made my way through the house, Walter's house, my house, now a home for an expanded definition of family he had helped create. In the living room, the chess set caught my eye again. I paused, remembering our final game, left unfinished when Walter became too tired to continue. On impulse, I sat down at the board, studying the pattern of pieces frozen in time for over a year now. Walter had been playing white, as he always did. I had been black. The game had reached a complex middle stage, with several possible paths forward. I considered the board carefully, then reached out and moved one of Walter's white pieces, completing the move he had been contemplating when fatigue overcame him. Then I made my responding move as black. "Your turn, Walter," I said softly to the empty chair across from me. There was no answer, of course. No hand emerging from the shadows to move. Another piece, but as I sat in the quiet room, I felt a profound sense of connection to the man who had become a father to me, whose wisdom continued to guide me, whose trust had changed the course of my life. The game would remain unfinished, a fitting metaphor for life itself, always evolving, never truly complete. But in playing both sides now, in considering Walter's perspective alongside my own, I had found a way to continue our conversation beyond the boundaries of life and death. Outside, the wind stirred the chimes Walter had hung years ago on the porch, creating a gentle melody that drifted through the open window. I listened, imagining it as Walter's response, his acknowledgement of our ongoing connection. "I understand," I whispered. "I'll keep playing, for both of us." And in that moment, I knew that Walter Sheffield's final testament, his true legacy, was alive and well, continuing to unfold in ways that even he, master strategist that he was, could never have fully anticipated. It lived in me, in James and Travis, in Eleanor and her unborn child, in the foundation that bore his name, in the land he had protected, in the truth he had ultimately ensured would prevail. It was, in the end, a legacy worthy of the complex, imperfect, deeply human man who had created it, and for that, I would be eternally grateful. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.